the North Koreans have suffered badly. They have not had much air cover or back up from the Russian forces. They're terrified of surrendering, and in many cases have committed suicide. They haven't been adequately prepared for this kind of conflict, and the Russians have now sort of basically taken them out of the front line and seeing what kind of logistic kind of jobs that they can give to them in Kursk. Certainly, the addition of these North Koreans has not enabled Russia to sort of sweep the Ukrainians out of the Kursk salient in the way that they would have hoped.
What is the situation generally at the moment in Ukraine with this conflict?
It's obviously not looking good for the Ukrainians, one has to be honest. The Russians are advancing. They're advancing slowly, kilometer by kilometer. They're losing a large number of soldiers, up to 1,500 a day, but they're still advancing. I think Putin's calculation is that, first of all, he can afford to lose a lot more troops because he has more manpower and he's not under the same political constraints with public opinion. As in Ukraine, to prevent him mobilizing more forces. And he can bring in North Koreans and mercenaries if he has a shortage. But I think Putin's calculation is to say, look, it's worth me taking enormous losses, not to seize more Ukrainian territory, no. It's worth me taking enormous losses because that way I convince the West that I'm mad enough to continue this fight and I'm not going to give up. And therefore, they either accept a peace on my terms or there's not going to be any peace. I think it's a form, of losing, unfortunately, large numbers of innocent Russian soldiers almost, although not all of them are innocent, it has to be said. But, for the purpose of making that kind of political point, don't expect me to be reasonable, accept a peace on my terms. And Putin's terms are quite severe. Give up NATO membership for Ukraine, put the Ukrainian army down to 50,000, no Ukrainian air force, obviously no nuclear weapons, although that's not really an issue at the moment. In other words, Ukraine would be effectively a demilitarized country, wholly under Russian military influence. You could point out that all is not lost for Ukraine. We're going into the fourth year in a couple of weeks of the war. They're still there. Very few people predicted that at the beginning. They've shown that they're plucky, when it comes to assassinating Russian generals on the streets of Moscow, or sending drones to blow up petrochemical or oil refineries in Russia, forcing the Russian ships out of the Black Sea, and they've inflicted severe losses on the North Koreans. So much so that the North Koreans have now basically stopped fighting. And at least for the time being, have been taken out of the front line. But those tactical successes, although good to boost Ukrainian morale, unfortunately can't, camouflage the big strategic picture, which is the Ukrainians are losing territory. They're having trouble raising their army. They started the war with 11 million soldiers that they could mobilize, and they've used up 7.4 million in mobilization or people they can't use, people who've gone abroad. So they haven't got much of reserve capacity left. And of course, they are dealing now with a generation of people who don't want to fight. Because they see all too well the reality of war. And of course, they see the Trump administration and the prospect that they'll be receiving less aid. The real danger, I think, Lewis, in a nutshell, is if the Russians do get to Pokrovsk, the objective they're trying to get to at the moment in Donetsk, a slow grinding advance could suddenly turn into a very quick advance. A bit like the end of the First World War, where the Allies advanced very slowly and then suddenly the German lines started to collapse. And all of a sudden the Allies were advancing very quickly and the war came to an end. This is because the territory is flat. You've got, lots of big strategic objectives. You've got roads, railway lines that the Russians could potentially exploit. So they could actually get to the middle of Ukraine in a fraction of the time that it's taken them to go do 65 miles from Bakhmut a couple of years ago in eastern Ukraine to Pokrovsk, where they are today. So there is a bit of a danger there for the Ukrainians that, if the Russians suddenly get hold of these important strategic objectives. But again, if providing the Ukrainians continue to receive military assistance, they can keep themselves in the fight and continue to exact a very high price on Russia. On the other hand, the good news for Ukrainians is that the Russian economy is now showing the strain. 30% inflation, declining ruble, for instance, hitting people quite hard, and that could force Putin to stop the war, particularly if the oil price goes down. But the question is can those sanctions be made to work before Ukraine is so exhausted that it simply has to give up the fight?
And you mentioned just a moment ago there the North Korean troops that are fighting in the Kursk salient.
Mm.
Um, you said they are now largely out of the fight. How has that come about?
They've taken big losses. Zelensky may be exaggerating sometimes, like anybody who's a commander in war tends to sort of play down losses, exaggerate successes. But I think the conventional wisdom of the intelligence community is that nonetheless the North Koreans have suffered badly. They have not had much air cover or back up from the Russian forces. They're terrified of surrendering, and in many cases have committed suicide. They haven't been adequately prepared for this kind of conflict, and the Russians have now sort of basically taken them out of the front line and seeing what kind of logistic kind of jobs that they can give to them in Kursk. Certainly, the addition of these North Koreans has not enabled Russia to sort of sweep the Ukrainians out of the Kursk salient in the way that they would have hoped. I mean, they had some initial successes, but the Ukrainians now at least seem to be holding on quite well. Now, what will that mean? Will they ask for more North Koreans, simply to sort of flood the numbers, or will they basically say to Kim Jong-un in North Korea, no, don't bother sending me more troops. We'll simply do a deal that you can continue to supply us with ammunition and missiles, and we'll give you satellite technology and oil and food in exchange. So that's going to be a good question. But the North Koreans certainly don't seem to have had the success that the Wagner or the Chechen sort of mercenary forces that Russia has been using quite extensively have had, particularly, for example, in the capture of Bakhmut a year ago.
And elsewhere in Europe, Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer is travelling to meet NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Are they going to be talking about these peacekeeping issues, or is it going to be more widely European security in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think the peacekeeping issue will basically come up tomorrow when Keir Starmer, Prime Minister Starmer, meets the EU heads of state. Rutte will be there, but because the discussion is basically a European discussion rather than a NATO discussion at the moment. Although NATO defence ministers meet next week, so they may have their word to say about it as well. And of course, it's an informal sort of exploratory discussion where everybody tries to sort of get a sense of what the other nation is willing or not willing to do, and sort of calibrate their own response accordingly. I think when it comes to the meeting with Mark Rutte, what the UK can continue to do to assist Ukraine, what kind of weapons the UK is able to supply, financial arrangements. Number two, cables in the Baltic Sea. The UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force is playing quite a big role alongside a NATO force in the Baltic Sea, trying to monitor. We had another incident just a couple of days ago where a Swedish cable was cut. 15 incidents. To try to deter that kind of so-called hybrid activity. The UK is being quite a big player there. Thirdly, the defence review. George Robertson is leading that, the former NATO Secretary General, UK Defence Minister. What can NATO expect in terms of, will the UK get to 2.5% of GDP? Mark Rutte has been calling, as you know, Lewis, for NATO now to go to 3.7% of GDP. Trump even more with 5%. The UK has always been a big spender, a traditional heavyweight in NATO, but this government so far has said 2.5 one day. And will Rachel Reeves, with of course all of her plans, be amenable to a lot more money on defence spending? Will it benefit the UK in terms of industrial production and so on? So I think Mark Rutte, as he does with every country, will be trying to get more clarity as to how far the UK can get up. Not it's at 2%, but how far it can get to 2.5, and would it be willing, for example, to support a NATO level of ambition of 3% when NATO leaders meet in The Hague in June, and of course, the extent to which the UK under financial constraints like everybody else, can modernise the army, modernise the navy, modernise the nuclear deterrent, procure the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, remain in the game of all of these different roles. Will it be able to project aircraft carriers to the Asia Pacific? Or are we getting to the stage where, like many middle-sized countries, the UK needs to think more about role specialisation, maybe focusing more on, defending the North Atlantic, up in the high north, anti-submarine activity, lines of communication, or what? It's not just about budgets. It's what is the level of strategic ambition that those budgets are destined to serve. But Sir Keir Starmer has been very, very supportive on Ukraine. Rutte will appreciate that, particularly at a difficult time for Ukraine. But I think it will be less about peacekeepers, which is a debate for tomorrow, because we don't have a peace yet. And in the meantime, you have to keep the Ukrainian army fighting. And what can the UK and NATO best do, particularly with the Trump uncertainties, to make that happen? Because if the Ukrainian army can't be fighting, there'll be a peace, but it won't be a peace that NATO has any role in keeping, because it will be a Russian dictated peace.
And just finally, Jamie, you mentioned Trump there, of course. I mean, it really is the big question. As of today, are there any signs that an end to this war is closer than before Donald Trump's inauguration?
Well, yes, in the sense that, Trump is continuing to say that that's going to be one of his objectives. I don't think anybody ever believed him when he said that he could do it in 24 hours. I'm not sure he believed in himself, but certainly he continues to say that that's something that he intends to get done, although his staffers are now talking about 100 days or 6 months. It will take longer. So the tone is more realistic, which is welcome. And something else that Trump has done is upset the Russians a lot more than I thought he was going to do. I thought that he might fly off to a summit with Putin immediately. No, nothing is scheduled yet. Or that he would immediately make concessions to Moscow to win Putin's favor. But he hasn't done so. He's upset the Russians by saying the United States is going to build a big new missile defense system against Russian missiles. The Kremlin hasn't reacted very positively to that. He's also said that he wants to lower the oil price to put more pressure on Russia, because Russia gets about 14 billion euros a year from its oil sales, and that's what funds the war. And if Trump goes after the oil, then Putin really is going to be in big trouble. So the idea that he would be tough on Zelensky and go easy on Putin, so far, no, he's putting pressure on Putin. And I think that is an encouraging sign. Another thing that the Americans have done this week is they've sent some of their Patriot air defense systems from Israel to Ukraine. Not necessarily something that got the blaze of publicity, but it's a sign that the United States is still there. If Trump would at least agree that the $4 billion of unspent funds in the Pentagon accounts that Biden was not able to use before he left office, if that appropriated money, already appropriated, could still be spent on equipping Ukraine, that would be good. I mean, this week what has happened is that the Americans have frozen their foreign aid programs, as you know, and that's hit Ukraine hard in terms of civil programs, public health, for instance, public administration, all of these things. But the Americans have not yet frozen the military aid, despite all of the threats. So hopefully Trump at least is trying to create more of an even playing field in which he's going to be as effective at putting pressure on the Russians to be reasonable as obviously he would do on the Ukrainians. But the key thing for the Europeans and Ukrainians is to make sure they have a seat at the table, and that this is not done over their heads and behind their backs, but they are participants, because obviously they are going to be in the front line of the ramifications before the United States of whatever is decided.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.